In this video, I'm going to discuss 10 death metal albums that aren't considered part of the traditional death metal canon, but which I feel should be. When I'm talking about the canon, I am of course referring to albums that are widely recognized as essential within the genre. You might expect this list to be comprised mainly of early to mid-90s albums, and the period is represented, yes, but I've resisted this to some extent. It seems every death metal album from this period has been canonized at some point, and I'm not here just to heap more praise on Cross the Styx or Slumber of Sullen Eyes. There are some newer albums here. As far as I'm concerned, we have just lived through a second golden age of death metal, and it would be disingenuous of me not to reflect this in the list. This list is not intended to focus entirely on obscure, unknown albums. Underrated does not necessarily mean unknown. Indeed, I have included works from legacy acts that I feel are as deserving, or in some cases more deserving, than what are generally regarded as their key works. Full disclosure, I am, to some extent, largely an OSDM fan, and I generally shy away from progressive or some forms of tech death, black and death, slam and gore grind. It is what it is. Surgical Steel. There is no consensus amongst fans as to what Carcass's best album is. Heartwork is most frequently cited, but I don't get the impression that it's the fans' choice. Heartwork is probably their most accessible album, and the title track is the closest thing they have to a signature tune, hence why I think the album tends to get the nod from casual fans. Carcass diehards, on the other hand, don't seem to have a consensus. Psychopaths prefer Reek, contrarians bend towards Swan Song. I'm a Necrotism man. Reek was fun when it came out, but the production, despite what the Psychopaths would have you believe, is absolute garbage, to the point that it makes the album unlistenable in anything other than one or two song bursts. If ever an album deserved a re-recording, it's this one. Symphonies of Sickness was a big step in the right direction, not just in terms of production, but also songwriting. I have a lot of time for this album and don't think less of anyone who argues that it's their best. Still, for me, Necrotism was just a light year ahead of those albums. It's the Sgt. Pepper's of death metal. Of all death metal's early albums, this is the one that really showed what the genre was capable of delivering. Not only its conceptual feel, but how it managed to incorporate melody within the death metal framework without having to lift elements from other genres and sacrifice brutality. Heartwork veered a little too much towards death and roll for my taste, and Swan Song, I actually liked it when it came out, but I don't listen to it much anymore. Actually, I haven't heard it in years and don't have any particular desire ever to again. Surgical Steel then. Surgical Steel is not only one of the greatest comeback albums in the history of metal, but one of the greatest comeback albums in the history of music. No band has a right to record an album this good 17 years after they split up. It's practically obscene. Doubly so since Steer and Walker seem to have some weird disdain for death metal. The attention to detail that has gone into this album is staggering. It's traditional English craftsmanship at its finest, a handmade willow cricket bat of an album. The Eastern-sounding melodic guitar solo over a doomy stomp in congealed clot of blood, the groove sections that drive the first half of the Master Butcher's Apron, the uber-slick transitions of non-compliance as it cycles through a seeming dozen sections over the course of 6 minutes, the chorus of granulating dark satanic mills, the most death and roll song on the album, one of the catchiest things they've ever written, the weird guitar break and tremolo sections that haunt Captive Bolt Pistol, elevating what might otherwise be a fairly generic track, and the epic kitchen sink closer, Mount of Execution. Musically, it falls somewhere in the sweet spot between Necrotism and Heartwork. It is recognizably death metal, but not as pure death metal as either Necrotism or Symphonies. There are certainly some death and roll elements, particularly in the album's second half, but it's probably the thrashiest album they've ever done, which is no bad thing. I feel that thrash suits them better than the death and roll vibe. I love thrash, so that might just be me. The production is perfect. It's a joy to listen to. It's dripping honey. It's surgical precision. It was, rightly, critically acclaimed when it came out, but it seems a lot of the praise came from a place of surprise that it wasn't total shit. It doesn't deserve to be judged as a comeback album or a late career album. It stands tall amongst Carcass's formidable discography in its own right. Spit out your coffee at this if you must, but it might be the best album they ever did.
Bill Steer is a beautiful man.
Look at him. I'm not gay, but if I had to...
What the hell are you talking about?
Abstract principles taken to their logical extremes. Of all the albums on this list, this one is probably pushing the definition of death metal the furthest. It is death metal, but it's not death metal as we know it. It's utterly unique, both completely without precedent nor subsequent parallel, at least in death metal. It has always put me in mind of Cathedral's Forest of Equilibrium, not so much sonically, although Abstract Principles does not shy away from slower tempos and spends most of its time in a kind of slow to medium BPM, by death metal standards. But it has this lurching, crawling, oppressive feel. The vocals are certainly Forest of Equilibrium adjacent. The growls are generally intelligible. Unlike Forest of Equilibrium, it's pure British folk horror. It is Arthur Machen, or Machen, is it Machen? Given musical flesh. Many of the songs push the 10-minute mark and have an almost Gabriel-era Genesis epic storytelling feel. The band frequently employs non-standard instrumentation, even interspersing the grinding distortion with acoustic guitars and clean folk vocals. Not for everyone by any means. If you prefer your death particularly technical or brutal, stay clear. It has its faster moments, but it's generally contemplative rather than extreme. But anyone with an open mind should definitely check out this deeply strange but brilliant album. Vanquish in Vengeance. Incantation are one of death metal's most consistent bands. I don't think they ever recorded a bad album. A couple of their later ones are just good rather than excellent, but that's the worst I can say about them. I never got into Mortal Thrones, but a lot of people seem to like it, so I'm willing to concede that it's a me not you thing. Golgotha is a classic, Diabolical Conquest is a classic, Infernal Storm is a classic, but Vanquish and Vengeance might just be their best, and it's high time fans started throwing some love this album's way. It's the most atmospheric album they ever did. It's absolutely suffocating. It's like choking on smoke. It's repulsively and unremittingly ugly. Incantation have always walked a fine line between death, death doom, and outright doom, and Vanquish and Vengeance leans quite heavily into the death doom. Mostly, it lumbers along with occasional blasts of speed cutting through the murk. Legion of Dis, the epic closer, is one of the most crushing doom metal songs ever. I've always preferred Mackenzie as a vocalist over the other vocalists the band has employed. Also, the production on this album is nigh on perfect. I'm not one of these purists who insist that death metal production peaked in the early 90s under Scott Burns and who think that instrumental separation is a betrayal of genre principles. I don't like my death metal too polished either. I find compressed noise wearying over the course of extended listens. This is how you do it. Everything good about modern production techniques with none of the bad. The Reprobate. Firespawn just do everything right. I've heard them criticised for being basic and generic, and well, no wheels are invented in any of their albums. The group consists or consisted of members of Entombed, Necrophobic, Unleashed, Defleshed and Dark Funeral, all good honest folk who helped invent that wheel. They groove, they chug, they shred, they know when to inject blasts of death metal brutality whenever it's in danger of becoming a bit tame. Good old school death metal done well is like a comfort blanket. Firespawn to me are like a palate cleanser after listening to too much tech death. It's easy, fun listening when you don't want to get completely pummeled but still have enough hair on your balls not to want to listen to melodic death metal, or as I call it, not death metal, or as it is most commonly known, that Gothenburg shite. There's probably not much to choose between any of their albums, but this one is my favourite. This is probably the most brutal one they did. It also contains Serpent of the Ocean, the closest thing death metal produced to a feel-good hit of the summer. The album is wall-to-wall with great, catchy riffs. They're practically a pop band. They've recently reformed, with the Grave singer taking over from Petrov following his death a few years ago. Not sure how I feel about this. I'm excited at the prospect of more material and the chance to see them live, but one major reason I loved Firespawn in the first place was the fact that Petrov was one of my favourite death metal vocalists. If you're one of those elitists who turn your nose up at Firespawn, get over yourself. Suffer and Become. I criticised modern rock production earlier, and here is an example of its worst excesses. The album is so loud that it's practically clipping. It sounds like Rick Rubin did it, drunk, and yet it also stands as a rare example of this production style actually working. The ridiculously loud production sounds like an artistic choice rather than studio incompetence, and complements the album's unhinged barrage. The album is absolutely insane. It's just a complete assault. After about 90 seconds into Shame and its afterbirth, the first song, the album hits 100 miles an hour and pretty much stays there for its entire duration with very little variation. Somewhere around the album's halfway mark, there's an instrumental, Survival's Careening Inertia, which has a melodic, clean guitar intro, but the rest of the song is as insane as the rest of the album, if not worse. That's about the only respite the album offers, save a few mid-tempo sections that generally last about 5 seconds and sound more like the guitarist is bending down to retrieve a dropped pick as opposed to a calculated decision to offer the listener a break. The guitar work is maddening and alien. It makes me think of writhing snakes. It's also about as close to true beauty as I've heard in death metal. Shame and its afterbirth brings tears to my eyes. Albums like this are the reason that death metal endures while other metal genres flounder and sink. Even now, nearly 40 years after the fact, this genre, that should, on paper, have run out of new ground to tread long ago, continues to produce albums like this that sound like nothing else before it. Pure Blood Doom. I've got a soft spot for Fin Death. Sullen Eyes and Without God are rightly venerated as genre classics, but for me, Adramelech are the missing link in this unholy trinity. Psychostasia is the one everybody mentions, but I've always preferred Pure Blood Doom. Recorded in 1999, it sounds more like early 90s death. It's dark, atmospheric, and occasionally technical. It's also maybe the grooviest of the Fin Death albums, but they don't overdo the mid-tempo stomping, or at least when they do, they seem to have a knack for keeping things interesting. It's not progressive death metal, but it's got that kind of feel nonetheless. The whole thing is so cohesive, it feels like a concept album, and the songs feel epic, like the music is telling a story, possibly due to the very odd song structures. Good production. It's got that early 90s murky feel, but there's instrument separation in there. The guitar tone is nasty, there's something mechanical about it. Cool cover too. On Strange Loops. I'm obsessed with the idea of regional variations within genres and how these either shape or are shaped by the tastes and expectations of the listeners within the parent culture. There are 3 British death metal albums on this list and plenty of others floating around just outside the 10 that I finally chose. Now, I love the New York and Floridian death bands, but British death metal, which was never a dominant scene within the wider death metal world, in particular seems to spark my imagination. I think this runs deeper than local bias because I've lost count of the number of times I've been listening to a seemingly generic or unremarkable death metal album, but something about it nevertheless makes my balls tighten, so I look up the band and realise that they're British. It makes sense that I should count Carcass, Bolt Thrower and Napalm Death, okay, not a death metal band, I know, amongst my favourites because of the grindcore connection. The first wave of British death metal bands arrived at death metal through grindcore rather than thrash metal, and therefore Brits who were knocking around in the late 80s and early 90s are, on the whole, going to be predisposed to taking their death with at least a pinch of grindcore. But we're past that now. There was a time, long ago, British grindcore bands were figuring out how to play their instruments and evolving into death metal bands, and the Swedes were busy cornering the world market of HM2 pedals, and the New Yorkers were inventing proto-slam, but today that's no longer the case. South Americans produce Swedeth. Brits are as likely as anyone to be peddling Floridian-style OSDM. American grindcore bands are a dime a dozen. But still, I think there must be something baked into the DNA of regional music scenes that appeals to something baked into the DNA of its listeners, to the extent that when British bands are peddling OSDM, a style not native to the UK, there is nevertheless something particularly seductive about it, to me, even if I can't put my finger on what. I'd love to know if New Yorkers or Swedes or Floridians or any brand of death metal fan with a regional scene reports similar experiences. My feeling is that they must. Mithras is an interesting example. What they do couldn't be further divorced from grindcore, and there's nothing I consider remotely British about their sound, but I fell in love with them the moment I heard them. Possibly non-Brits will be unmoved by their music, I don't know. I don't see them getting much love online. Whatever, all Mithras' albums are classic. Worlds Beyond the Veil would probably be in this top 10, but the production leaves me a bit underwhelmed. I'm going to go with this one. It's experimental, progressive tech death that leans towards the brutal end of the spectrum. Now, I don't mind tech death, but I'm generally not a fan of progressive death. I take bands on a case-to-case basis. Too much wankery is a no. Jazz influences are a no. For an album we would broadly classify as experimental, brutal, progressive tech death, On Strange Loops is surprisingly accessible. The Statue on the Island is one of the catchiest tech, brutal death songs ever, and for all its searing aggression, the album is more melodic than anything produced by an actual so-called melodic death metal band. It covers a lot of ground, from hypnotic death doom stomps to guitar solos that wouldn't sound out of place on a 70s rock album, choral chanting, clean guitars, mad reverb, synth work, and some of the most explosive blast beats I've ever heard. The whole thing is wrapped in a package of cosmic death, which I won't go into here because anomalous abstractigate infinitesimus. Space is an underutilized theme in death metal. We have plenty of well-established and acceptable themes such as Satanism, horror, Lovecraft, Egyptology, but we could do with more cosmic death. Space ambient paints soundscapes where the universe is serene and beautiful. Hawkwind were space pirates, but death metal is uniquely positioned to explore the horror of the void. The most famous cosmic death metal band, of course, is Blood Incantation, who I like, but Gigan do it better. For a start, they are one of the few death metal bands who figured out how to properly incorporate synth elements into death metal, not as a creepy song opening mechanic like in that Massacre song, but as an integral part of the music. It is entirely possible that cosmic death is the only place where synths are going to feel natural in death metal. I am a casual fan of synthwave music, and I remember getting excited when Frozen Soul, whose first album I really enjoyed, announced they were collaborating with Ghost for their second album. The results, however, left me feeling a bit underwhelmed. The synths consisted of Ghost playing the song's main riff on a synth for 50 seconds before the band kicked in and the synths promptly do one. It felt like a missed opportunity. Maybe they couldn't find a way to incorporate the synths into the song proper. Gigan have. The synths here don't have any melodic function, but serve to both complement the relentless noise with swooshes and gurgles and bloops, and to fill whatever tiny spaces aren't occupied by the 100 miles an hour frantic dissonant tech brutality. Then again, none of the instruments in Gigan seem to serve any melodic function. It's bonkers stuff. Their overall sound is weird, alien, and unlike anyone else. It's practically psychedelic death metal. I've heard their relentless dissonance and brutality described as jarring, but it's one of those albums you just gotta let wash over you. The tempos generally don't vary much, and this acts as a lifesaver for your sanity, something for your brain to cling on to. When you do stop fighting against the album, the effect is strangely hypnotic, colourful, and as immersive as any of the space ambient works. Gigan have been knocking around for a while now, and this is their 5th album, each one better than the last. Insane Sickness. I can be a bit fussy when it comes to death metal production. 30-something years after the release of Obituary's Cause of Death, I'm still not sure whether I like it. At first, I hated it. The whole thing sounded squashed and lifeless, the vocals too loud, the guitars too dry, and the drums hitting like effeminate slaps instead of manly punches. However, after a while I started feeling like maybe the lifeless production suited what was a deeply ugly, evil-sounding album. Then I started disliking it again. I still don't know. Here's another one whose production I have a troubled relationship with. Had Insane Sickness been released in 1990, I might be a little bit more forgiving, but it wasn't. It was 1996. It's not good enough. There's been times when I put this album on and turned it off after a couple of tracks on account of the production. Despite this, I inevitably end up returning. Why? It's a classic, plain and simple. A cursory listen might suggest standard 90s death metal, but there's more to it than that. The drummer seems to think he's in a funk rock band half the time. The drums are also pushed forward in the mix and are just about the only instrument that has any life to it, which makes me wonder if he produced it. It sounds like one of those drum cover videos on YouTube. They're also very clattery. It takes some time to get used to. The bass, when you can actually hear it, has a pretty decent sound, and the guitars have a suitably nasty tone, which is a shame because other than that, the whole thing sounds dry and kind of muddy. Uneven, slightly disappointing production then. There is, nevertheless, something about this album. It relies heavily on groove, and mid-pace sections are generally thrashy, which places it in my wheelhouse. It never reaches absolute breakneck speed, and even flirts with doom without ever actually committing. I wouldn't call any of the riffs on this album iconic, but there's not a boring moment on the entire thing. The band just seemed to have an instinctive sense for how to keep the listener's ears engaged. When to chug, when to speed up, when to slow down. Basic stuff, but you can't teach it. For the true pros, this shit is innate. Their ability to transition also seems particularly instinctive and organic. Overall, the album is uncomplicated stuff, which despite their raw, ugly sound actually makes the album a surprisingly easy listen, which isn't to say there aren't surprises along the way. Short, sudden flirtations with doom riffs, a melodic guitar solo, synth stabs during a groove section. Don't listen to this album on good speakers or earphones. It sounds muddy as fuck. I've got a shitty old cassette player with tinny speakers which kind of complements the album's feel.